Paris, March 28, 1757. An eerie silence hangs over the Place de Grève. Tens of thousands of people crowd into every available space, clinging to windows, rooftops, and even chimneys. Nobles have paid fortunes for privileged balcony views. Crowds have come from across France, some traveling for days. All want to witness the spectacle about to begin, the most elaborate and terrifying execution in French history. At the center of the square, a wooden platform has been erected. All around, soldiers struggle to maintain order. The tension is palpable. People whisper to each other about the condemned man and his extraordinary crime. A man, a mere servant, who dared raise his hand against the sacred body of the king, will be subjected to the most terrible punishment ever devised by the French state. A cart creaks into the square. On board is Robert-François Damiens, a 42-year-old domestic servant, pale and almost unrecognizable after months of torture in the Bastille dungeons. His crime? Attacking King Louis XV with a small pocket knife, causing only a superficial wound. The exact motive remains a mystery, but the French crown is determined to erase any questioning of its authority through an unprecedented display of brutality. As Damiens is bound to the scaffold, whispers in the crowd reveal circulating rumors. "They say he was possessed," a woman whispers. "No, he was influenced by seditious philosophers," replies another. "I heard he had mental troubles." The voices fall silent as the executioner appears, holding his terrible tools. To understand how Damiens arrived at this fatal moment, we must go back years, when he was just a humble servant, invisible among hundreds of others who served the French nobility. Robert-François Damiens was born in La Tilleoise, an obscure village in northern France, in January 1715. The son of a gatekeeper, his destiny seemed predetermined to a life of anonymous servitude. From a young age, he worked for various aristocratic families, building a contradictory reputation. He was known for his unstable temper, which frequently cost him jobs, but also for periods of devoted service. Contemporary accounts describe Damiens as a man of variable moods and unpredictable behavior. He worked in several noble residences and, for brief periods, at Versailles Palace itself, where he could observe French court life up close. His professional path was erratic. He often abandoned positions abruptly or was dismissed for insubordination. Those who knew him mentioned his tendency toward impassioned conversations about religion and politics, dangerous subjects in a France where the monarch's absolute authority was intrinsically linked to divine order. The political and social context of Louis XV's France is crucial to understanding Damiens' act. It was a period of growing tension. Louis XV's reign, which had begun with popular enthusiasm, earning him the nickname Beloved, had deteriorated considerably. Military defeats during the 7 Years' War, increased taxes, and the perception of a monarch more interested in personal pleasures than state affairs fueled discontent. Simultaneously, a fervent ideological battle divided France. On one side, Enlightenment philosophers questioned, with growing boldness, the foundations of absolute monarchy. On the other, the Catholic Church and Jansenist parliamentarians waged their own quarrels with the crown. Seditious pamphlets circulated in Paris, openly criticizing the king and his official mistress, Madame de Pompadour. It was in this cauldron of dissatisfaction that Damiens, an apparently ordinary man, committed an extraordinary act. On that cold afternoon of January 5, 1757, Louis XV was descending from his carriage at Versailles Palace after visiting his sick daughter. Wrapped in several layers of clothing against the cold, the king barely noticed when a man approached from behind and stabbed him with a small blade between the ribs. The wound was superficial, more a cut than a deep puncture. Louis XV, first thought he had merely been jostled until he noticed blood on his hand. "I am stabbed. Stop that man, but do not kill him," ordered the king, who, despite the wound's lightness, feared the blade might be poisoned, a concern that quickly proved unfounded. Damiens made no attempt to flee. He stood motionless, almost resigned. When the guard seized him, he simply said, "Let no one touch the king." I have something to tell him. What exactly he wanted to tell Louis XV remains one of the many unresolved questions in this case. During his interrogations, Damiens provided contradictory explanations. Sometimes, he suggested religious motives connected to Jansenist disputes. Other times, he spoke vaguely about the kingdom's poor administration and the suffering of the people. "If I had wanted to kill the king, I would have killed him," he insisted, suggesting his act had more of a symbolic or protest character than an assassination attempt. The French authorities, determined to uncover a larger conspiracy, subjected Damiens to brutal tortures, hoping to extract names of accomplices. Nearly 2 months of interrogations under torture produced no evidence of conspiracy. Damiens seemed to have acted alone, possibly influenced by seditious conversations heard in Parisian taverns and the houses where he had served. The possibility that a simple servant could, on his own initiative, attack the sacred body of the king was perhaps more terrifying for the French court than any conspiracy. It represented a fundamental rupture in the social fabric that supported the Ancien Regime. The notion that the monarch was untouchable, divinely ordained, and absolutely superior to his subjects. The trial that followed was a formality. The Parliament of Paris, though frequently in conflict with Louis XV on other matters, did not hesitate to condemn Damiens to the punishment reserved for regicides, even though the king had barely been injured. The sentence, pronounced on March 26, 1757, detailed with clinical precision each stage of the torture he would endure before death. And so, we return to that March morning on the Place de Grève. Damiens, more dead than alive after months of torture, is bound to a platform. The executioner, Henri Sanson, a man whose profession had been passed down through several generations of his family, approaches with red-hot pincers. What follows is so horrible that even the most impassive chronicler, Casanova, who attended the execution, later wrote, "I returned home sick and feverish." The execution stages are meticulously followed according to the sentence. First, Damiens' right hand, the one that had held the knife against the king, is burned with flaming sulfur. Then, pieces of his flesh are torn with red-hot pincers at the places where he will be dismembered: chest, arms, thighs, and calves. Molten lead, boiling oil, wax, and sulfur are poured into the open wounds. The crowd, which came to be entertained by human suffering, begins to faint by the thousands. Even veteran soldiers look away. The final stage is the quartering. 4 strong horses are attached to Damiens' limbs and driven in opposite directions. The human body, however, is surprisingly resilient. After half an hour of effort, Damiens' limbs still have not separated from his torso. Horrified whispers run through the crowd. Some see it as a divine sign, an indication that the punishment exceeds even God's justice. The executioner, embarrassed by this setback, asks permission from the magistrates present to make incisions at Damiens' shoulders and hips with a knife, thus facilitating the horse's work. Permission is granted. Finally, after almost an hour of indescribable torment, Damiens' body is torn apart. His remains are immediately burned and the ashes scattered to the wind, a final attempt to erase not only his physical existence, but also the memory of his defiance of royal authority. Damiens' death, however, produced the opposite effect of what the French crown had intended. Instead of reaffirming the monarch's absolute power, it exposed its fundamental fragility. The spectacle of state brutality was imprinted in the French collective memory. Voltaire, Diderot, and other Enlightenment philosophers cited the case as an example of the Ancien Regime's barbarity. In the decades that followed, as the discontent that would lead to the French Revolution fermented, Damien's execution was frequently mentioned in revolutionary pamphlets. Louis XV survived the attack for 18 additional years, but his popularity never recovered. The beloved became the object of public contempt, and the Damien's episode only intensified criticisms of his reign, considered decadent. When he died in 1774, few French mourned his departure. Curiously, Damien's execution was the last of its kind in French history. The growing influence of the Enlightenment was already changing public sensibilities regarding excessively cruel punishments. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, barely 32 years later, another French monarch, Louis XVI, would face execution. But his death by guillotine would be quick, almost merciful in comparison. The revolution, despite all its violence, never reproduced the methodical savagery that the Ancien Régime had reserved for Robert-François Damiens. 200 years later, philosopher Michel Foucault would begin his influential work Discipline and Punish with a detailed description of Damien's execution. For Foucault, this public spectacle of punishment represented not only the brutality of a bygone era, but a fundamentally different manifestation of state power, a power that operated through the public demonstration of force on the bodies of the condemned, in contrast with modern systems of surveillance and discipline that control through more subtle and psychological means. What makes Damiens' story so deeply troubling is not just the horror of his punishment, but the enigma of his motivation. Historians continue to debate: was he a religious fanatic, a revolutionary precursor, a mentally disturbed man, or simply an ordinary servant who, in a moment of despair or impulse, crossed an invisible and sacred line, defying the established order of an entire society? Whatever the truth about his motivations, Damien's execution remains one of the most brutal episodes in European judicial history, a moment when the state demonstrated all its vindictive power against an individual who dared to question, even momentarily and unsuccessfully, the inviolability of the royal body. His public dismemberment marks the apex, and ironically, the beginning of the end of an era when the king's body was considered sacred, and any aggression toward it, however minimal, deserved the most spectacular and terrible retribution.